right, welcome back. Our final little foray into the ancient Near East to get us situated before we move on and study ancient biblical texts. We have two more brief forays into ancient culture, and that is to talk about family structures and how they worked, and then also to talk about the gods. Of course, we'll talk about these more and in more detail as we move along in the class, but it helps to have these things in mind as we start. So, when we think about ancient families and how ancient societies or communities worked, this is a little ancient, this is a artist's reconstruction of kind of an ancient a little village. And you can see people are working together. Some people are doing certain activities. Everything's agricultural in a way, or some people are making clothes, or people are making objects that other people will use, but people are generally working together. And in these small communities, these small farming villages, we can say that culture, that families would have been understood to be patriarchal, patrilocal, and patrilineal. I'll explain these in just a moment, but the basic idea is that there's a symbolic house. This is not an actual house. It's a symbolic house, kind of like the House of Tudor or something, right? And this term is found throughout the ancient Near East, from Egypt all the way through to Persia, and that is the concept of the House of the Father. When we say patriarchal, we mean that this is a symbolically male-dominated culture. What we don't want to do is say that this was actually fully a male-dominated culture, because it often wasn't. Professor Christine Yoder has done a lot of research on this, but women actually had a considerable authority in some areas of the economy and of local household economic production, and so on. But symbolically, in terms of language and culture and legal rights, at least the way that legal rights were understood to be framed, oftentimes they work differently in practice. But there was a father, and not always the biological father of everyone in this community, but someone who is symbolically the father, often an older man, who had some claim to authority in that village or community, that small area in which everyone understood themselves to be related in terms of clan or tribe. Even if they weren't biologically related, they would understand themselves in these terms and sometimes talk about themselves in these terms in order to express their connection in economic and political life. So the patriarchal community was the house of the father. So when God tells Abram and Sarah, go from your father's house, there's not an actual physical structure that God is primarily interested in. In Genesis 12, verse 1, it's the entire sphere of political and economic and cultural life in which Abram and Sarah exist as a unit, and where all their safety is to be found, right? Where their water is found and their access to food is found, and where other people are around them making sure that they have a life. All of those people are organized in order to produce life together and sustain life together. Being told to leave that is actually quite traumatic, and it would have been understood to be a suicide mission in the ancient world. But of course, God is with them. So, but just to show you this slide here, which has a lot of this information written out in clearer terms. In the ancient world, marriages were primarily economic arrangements, as Professor Yoder has worked on as well, typically negotiated by a father or a brother of the bride, and the groom's family. So marriage was not primarily about love. There is love literature and language in the Old Testament. So the Song of Songs is a love poem or a series of love poems. But however, ancient people were primarily thinking of marriage in terms of the production of life and sustaining of life through farming. There's a great book by Tracy Lemos, Lemos, about the way that marriage works in the ancient world, if you're more interested in that. But then also, as I said, patriarchal. The ancient families were patriarchal. The father was understood to be the head of the household, the symbolic household, and the symbolic father too. The mother served as the household manager and often actually had more power in day-to-day operations than some of the men do. We can see this in the Bible too, but we can see this in other economic texts from the ancient world. Also in the ancient world, inheritance was understood to function patrilineally. That is, inheritance went from father to son, We're going to see that in ancient Israel, this gets challenged pretty early on in the book of Numbers, so we'll talk about that later. But just to say, this is a typical way that inheritance works. And then also we can say that families in the ancient world were understood, or in the ancient Near East especially, were understood to be patriarchal. That is, that wives would leave their family's house, the symbolic house of the woman's father, and the woman would generally come and live with the the husband's Beit Av, or in the symbolic house of that father. So this is kind of one way of thinking about that you didn't set out on your own in the ancient world. When people got married, they didn't form their own family unit. There was no such thing as a nuclear family that existed all by itself in the ancient world. They thought of themselves as kind of grafting into other substantially larger family units, and interpreted their own behavior and identity that way. So there is polygamy in the ancient world. That is the idea that it was understood to be acceptable legally and in many cases socially for a man to have more than one wife. The reverse was not true. It was not considered legally or socially okay for a woman to have two husbands or something like this. This is part of the patriarchal structure of the ancient Near East and the assumptions that go into it. Of course, I hope it goes without saying that, like, I think this is immoral, right? This is not good. When people talk about family values of the Bible, I want to respond and say that there are lots of different family values that are depicted in the Bible. Lots of different family units and structures are depicted in the Bible. Some, I think, are more valorous and should be upheld and lifted up as ethical examples. Like the family that is formed by Ruth and Naomi is, I think, an amazing form of family. It is also unusual in the ancient Near East. But then there are other forms that are seemingly supported by the Bible that I do think we need to ask questions about. And we need to say that this seems to be an abusive way to deal with other people. That is to say, the ethics of the ancient Near East, Israel emerges out of and is a part of an ancient Near Eastern culture. God doesn't make them perfect all at once, and especially at the very beginning. We're not perfect right now. We have a lot of problems in our own culture, no matter which culture you're a part of. I'm sure there are problems with it, right? Instead of kind of forcing people to be good from the very beginning, God decides to work with people who have their problems the whole way through. So that should free us up as readers of the Bible to ask questions about ancient Near Eastern culture and questions about Israelite culture and what's accepted. We don't have to accept slavery. We don't have to accept patriarchal structures in the family. We don't have to say those are normal. In the Bible, there are certain texts that suggest that women function as property of their husbands. But then there are other texts that push back against this. And there are texts within the Bible that ask questions about this and actually lift up a different way of organizing our ethical and family structures. So there's a conversation throughout the entire Bible about what is a family. And what I want to caution us about is not to pick a couple of examples and say we need to do this or this is good. We need to be able to ask questions about the people in the Bible and what they do all throughout. We also can ask questions about what God does too. We'll come to that later. But so in any event, so I've already mentioned kind of the Beit Av and how this looks and what this structure is. Again, a largely kind of self-sufficient group of people who at times will trade with their neighbors, but function really as an independent unit that is trying to produce surplus to give to the people that are demanding it of them while retaining enough to survive. Okay, so these folk in Israel typically lived in a 4-room house. We'll talk about this more later, but just to say, you've got the kind of the first floor would be where animals hung out and where you keep your farm implements. People would actually live on the second floor, and the roofs would be used for economic production. You can see some models here. We'll talk more about 4-room houses and how they work later on in the class, but you can see this is from the Harvard Semitic Museum up here. First floor was kind of industrial and used for livestock, and second floor was for the people. And you can see here people would make pottery. Pottery was a big deal in the ancient world. How do you store stuff? And you have to make it yourself. So people would make clay pottery. And here's a little depiction of an Israelite meal. And weaving looms. People would have to make their own baskets and make their own implements, make their own things for sleeping, arrangements for sleeping, their own clothes. So being able to work all of this yourself and do all this yourself would have been an important part of surviving in the ancient world. So there's a loom over there with weights on it, and here's some of those weights that have been recovered in archaeological remains and so on. I'm going to skip past this really quickly, but this is one of the earliest pieces of Israelite writing that we have, and it's a calendar of agrarian stuff. It's called the Gezer calendar from around 925 BC. You got Abijah, the scribe, actually signed it, which is amazing. But also it's this kind of thing. It's just like a traditional thing that's being passed down. This might have actually been like a scribal exercise, which is why the scribe would have signed it saying, hey, here's my homework. But in any event, so here's all this, a bit about like what to do with the calendar. So the earliest stuff we get from Israel is not stuff about God, it's stuff about how to farm. People use things like olive presses. This is kind of one of the basic technologies of the ancient world. In ancient Israel, they grew olives, and that was one of the few value-added things you could make, where you could make actually a little bit of extra money off of it. But also wine presses in Israel worked by people stepping on them, just like you'd imagine from ancient discussions and if you've ever seen people stomp in a wine press, that's actually how they used to do it. So here's a wine press from ancient Israel up here on top. So in any event, some people lived in villages. Almost everyone lived in local villages. A few people lived in cities. Cities were small in the ancient world, very small. Very few people lived in anything like a big city, and they were spread out. And even the big cities were small. This is Beersheba from the biblical time. It's very small, as you can see. There's not many people living here, right? And then over here, this is Jerusalem in the time of Isaiah. This is like Jerusalem at one of its heights. You can see there's like not many houses there, right? Decatur today, our little suburb of Atlanta, is much bigger than Jerusalem was in Isaiah's day. I mean, Jerusalem in David's day would have been smaller than the class size at Columbia Theological Seminary. I mean, we're talking a few hundred people. So this is, we're thinking of very, very small numbers. By the way, in the ancient world, land was prevalent, and everyone had land. What people didn't have were people. Labor was scarce in the ancient world. So getting labor and keeping it by getting people indebted to you, that was the way that you became wealthy in the ancient world. Some would say that's also a way that remains powerful today. Okay, so lastly, religion. What do people think about the gods? We'll be talking about this a lot throughout the course, so we don't need to get everything right now. But just to say, in the ancient world, everyone, except maybe Israel, right? But we'll talk about this in the coming days. But in the ancient world, it was everyone assumed that they were polytheist, and everyone assumed everyone else was polytheist. That is, that there are lots of gods. The assumption is there are lots of gods all over the world, and that people have their own local gods. And you don't need to fight about gods. That if someone else wants to worship their god, that's great. I have my gods, you have your gods. Other people don't force people to worship gods in the ancient world. They also don't try to force people not to worship gods, right? The idea is we've all got our gods, great. There's kind of a live and let live attitude among gods in the ancient world. Sometimes the gods are understood to fight each other, and sometimes people would fight like in response to that. But generally speaking, there was nobody ever came to Israel and said, stop worshiping your gods. Instead, they would say, worship our gods too, because the assumption is that there's lots of gods and that everyone is going to be able to worship each other's gods. So that is the basic assumption of the ancient world. The assumption also is that the gods are hierarchical, that there are higher gods and lower gods. And you can tell who's the highest god because it's the god of the people who are in charge at the time. So if Pharaoh's in charge of the Levant at the time, well then, the Egyptian gods are predominant. But if Marduk, the god of Babylon, becomes the highest god, well then that's because Babylon expanded and conquered everyone. That's how you can tell. So the Pantheon is kind of all of the gods that you can list, but then you could also list them hierarchically. And sometimes they're understood to be biologically related, like there's father and mother gods, and there's children gods, and so on. And sometimes those are understood to be kind of rankings, right? So there's all kinds of stories in the ancient world about the gods, and some of them conflict with one another, and that was okay. No one thought that there was only one story you could tell about the gods, and it doesn't seem that people thought that if two stories conflict about a god's parentage or about a god's locality or identity or what the god did, those don't seem to be things that people have to fight about. There isn't a sense that there's one and only one true right way to talk about a god, any particular god. Insulting someone's god was not a good idea, but telling two different stories that conflicted wasn't a way to insult them. They just weren't worried about that. So this is a procession of gods in Assyria. This is the Assyrian king right here, and the king is seeing a procession of gods. By the way, gods and goddesses were understood to ride on totem animals that symbolized them. So you remember the golden calf? Nobody in Israel was worshiping a calf. No one thought they were worshiping a calf. They were worshiping the god that rode on the calf. So these gods were understood to kind of symbolically ride on the calf. Sometimes the gods were processed with their cult statues. They were represented by statues, but they weren't understood to be limited to those statues. They could exist all over the place. In heaven, they could exist in particular things. Dagon, the god of wheat. Dagon means wheat in ancient Semitic languages. Dagon was the god of wheat. Dagon was found in wheat. Dagon was also found in the heavens. Dagon was also found in the temple, in the cult statue. Ancient peoples were not worried about philosophical contradictions about where gods were or what their bodies were composed of or things like that they could be in two places at once. That wasn't a problem to ancient people, just like there could be many stories about one god. So one thing to know about gods in the ancient Near East is that they were often understood to be related biologically. So in Mesopotamian theology, Anu and Antu have the sun god Enki, and Enki and Hershag are related, and Enlil is related, and so on. These gods were often related, though, to particular towns. So here's Marduk right here. Marduk is the god of Babylon. Everyone knows Marduk's a god, and no one's mad that people are worshiping Marduk outside of Babylon. But Marduk is special to Babylon. So it's, there would have been a big temple to Marduk in Babylon. There would have also been temples to lots of other gods in Babylon, because you don't just worship one god. You have one god that's like special to your king, probably, in like your town. But you would have had a local god, right? You would have worshipped lots of gods. You would have understood lots of gods, and there would have been gods you don't worship that you still recognize as gods, and you wouldn't have had a problem with them. They just weren't part of your local cult. Cult mean not in a bad way. Cult just meaning your religious practices. So one thing about the ancient world, of course, is that the gods choose kings, and you can tell which god is in charge, or which king's in charge, and which god that king likes. So that's theocracy, the idea that the gods choose the king. Powerful idea, right? This is an Akkadian king who has horns on his head. If you ever see a sculpture from the ancient world or a painting where someone has horns on their head, that means that they are understood to be a god as well. So this is a king who's kind of become a minor god. Okay, one other thing to say is that the gods dwell in temples. The word for temple in the ancient world is the same as the word for palace. In Hebrew, that was Hechal, stolen from Mesopotamians. It just means big palace. The gods had palaces. The kings had palaces. Same word. The palace of the god had an outer courtyard, just like you have, like a major building has like a courtyard, right? So it's a courtyard where you can meet people but not let them inside. And then there would have been an inside space, kind of understood to be like the living room of the god. And then there was the god's bedroom, often called the Holy of Holies, the holiest space. And this would have been a place where only certain people were allowed at certain times, because just like you don't let anyone in your bedroom, right? Neither did the gods. The kings lived in their temples in the same way. They lived in their palaces the same way. Of course, temple, palace, the same thing. This is a little image, a reconstruction of a procession. Here's the cult statue of the god Shamash, the sun god in ancient Mesopotamia, being processed up to this, which is a ziggurat. A ziggurat wasn't a temple. It was a place where the gods were understood to kind of come down from heaven and walk down or meet people here. So there was a temple kind of at the top of it, but no god lived there. You'd bring the cult statue up there and then have like the god kind of hang out with the god there. Understand that the god would occupy the body of the statue there. So this is kind of how temples work. They're houses, big house, like the ziggurat was the kind of the place to meet the gods when they came down from heaven. But if they were dwelling with you for any long period of time, they would understood to live in the temple. The temple was their home, the home of the gods. This is also how ancient Israel understands its temple. We can also talk in terms of processions, like offerings and sacrifices and so on. We'll spend a lot more time talking about this, but just to say, this is one of the earliest pieces of culture from the ancient Near East that we know of. It's called the Warka vase. It was actually stolen during the Iraq War and was returned, discovered not long ago, and returned to the Iraq Museum. This is it's a pre-literate. This is before writing existed. This is a sculpture from Mesopotamia, and you can see that there are people bringing stuff, plates of stuff, and rams. They're bringing all sorts of stuff to the priest and priestess, who are understood to be representing the god or goddess, and they're receiving all of these goods, which were given to the god, right? They're actually used by the priests and by the king, but the regular people weren't supposed to know that, right? In fact, one of the first ever detective stories in history, maybe the first, was in the book of Daniel. It's an additional part of Daniel, so maybe not in your book of Daniel, but it's called Bel and the Dragon. The Catholic Church uses this, the Eastern Church uses it, but anyway, Bel and the Dragon is the first mystery, kind of locked door mystery, where Daniel uses detective skills to discover that is actually the priests eating the food in the temple of Baal instead of the god, as is suspected by the people. But there are all sorts of rules about how to offer sacrifices, right, and offerings, and there's all sorts of issues of purity that we'll get into here too. There are like rules throughout the ancient world, of which Israel is a part. Israel takes these ideas about purity and cleanliness or uncleanliness that have to do with temple spaces, and they mold it to their own theology, but they're borrowing the basic ideas from the peoples around them, and we'll get to that in more detail later. People in the ancient world thought they heard from the gods, primarily through omens. The gods would like put messages. This is a little clay model of a sheep's liver, which was understood in the ancient world to be a great place to hear from the gods. The gods, it's kind of like the post-it notes of the gods were sheep livers. And if you wanted to know what a god said, you would have to cut open a sheep, take their liver out, and see if there was any unusual part of their liver. And if there was an unusual part of it, then you would like look in this big book of sheep livers and find what the omen was, what the message was that the god was trying to give you. That's called divination, trying to find out what the gods are saying. And extispacy is the practice of trying to read livers. They would read other things too, the stars, astrology. Thought the gods sent messages there. They thought the gods sent messages in the way that birds moved, like flocks of birds. All kinds of things were used to describe, to try to divine messages from the gods. There was a little subset of people who were diviners trying to find messages from the gods who actually just heard directly from the gods, but they were thought to be very strange, and almost no one cared about them in the ancient world. They were untrained, poor. These are people that we would call prophets today. They were almost ignored in the ancient world, except for a few places in the Levant, including Israel. So one thing to think about when you think about gods in the ancient world is that there was this hierarchy of gods, and the average person couldn't talk to a high god. Just like I can't go talk to, the governor of Georgia if I wanted to today. I want to go yell at the governor of Georgia about registering voters. I can't do that today because the governor has more things to do. Maybe maybe the governor doesn't, but whatever. But I can't go just call the president or the executive director of the United Nations and say, "Hey, I got a message for you. I'm a random guy." I can't do that because I have to work through the bureaucracy, right? Well, gods were understood to work this way too. Priests and kings could talk to high gods, like Marduk or like Baal, the storm god of Canaan, or like Ra, the sun god of ancient Egypt, or Horus. You had to be a high-ranking person to do that. There were gods also, like lower gods, who worked for those high gods. Think of them as like the secretaries of the high gods. And those would be associated with like clans or tribes or groups of workers. Kind of think of like unions, people who worked in guilds. So you would have these different kind of levels. And then there would be like the lowest of the gods. Think of like the manual laborers among the gods. And those would be the ones that like a local family would be connected to. And you'd have in-home shrines. So this is a home. the reconstruction of an ancient Israelite home, and we actually see these shrines in ancient Israel. Sorry, the prophets yell at people, kind of common Israelites all the time, about how they are worshiping these local shrines, right? So we know that Israelites do this, and wherever you dig up stuff from ancient Israel, you find these local shrines. Sorry, they were worshiping local gods, right? Household gods. So there was a sense in ancient Israel and among their neighbors that there were these household gods that had time for you, because that was their job, was to take care of local people. But they also didn't have much power, right? They were the lowest of the gods. But then there were like local gods. This is a cult shrine from Ta'anak, a city in Israel. And this is, some people think it might depict Yahweh, this little sun up here on top of the back of a calf, but we don't know. It doesn't say Yahweh on that or anything, but it could have been like a local god, like a tribe god or a clan god. And then you would have the main gods living in the temples. So just to say, this is kind of an organization, like again, one of those kind of nested dolls, right? You have local gods, and then you have the main gods of the kingdom, who I wouldn't have been able to connect to. I'm just a lowly person, right? I'm not a priest. I'm actually not ordained. And I'm not important in any way. So I would have had just access to the local gods. Maybe the family god would have kind of a connection to the higher gods, and I could send a message to them. That would be my best guess about how I could talk to them in the ancient world. Okay, so that's it. There's much more to say about the ancient world, but I hope that gives you a little taste of what it's like. We're going to try to immerse ourselves in this ancient culture and try to understand as much as we can from their eyes and from their perspective what they were trying to say about the world and how it was created this coming week. So it's been a lot of information, I know. Remember, you're not being tested on any of this. The point is just to kind of soak it in and try to retain whatever you can as you engage Genesis, and we'll go through and follow through. But my hope is that this kind of broad synthetic overview of the ancient world will help us all just get into that mindset a bit more when we interact with the biblical text. So the next module will be on Genesis. Chapters 1 and 2 will be in the Bible thoroughly after that point. So get ready to crack open your biblical texts, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.